Hi, I'm Caitlin E, and welcome to the Lit Review. Today we're doing my January wrap-up, and this is the first time that I will be doing like a mid-month and then a final wrap-up. But if you've already watched my mid-month wrap-up for January, then you're pretty familiar with these three books plus Night Song by Beverly Jenkins. So I will link that up above so you can see my reviews of all of these books here. But those four books have already been covered in review. I will be mentioning some of these with my stats because this secondary wrap-up, the wrap-up for the end of the month, is where all my stats are gonna live. So I will be kind of discussing these, just not in depth. Today we're talking about three specific books, but we're also going to be talking about all of the stats for everything I read in January. So what I'm going to do, as I always do for you, is I've got some timestamps down below. The stats section is going to be a little bit more voluminous in the new year, but I'm really excited about what that means, and it's going to work out really well with this mid-month section since I will have fewer books to cover. So timestamps for both when stats start and when each individual reviews start are going to be below so that you can skip around if you'd like to. The other thing you need to know about my wrap-up system, and I promise I will not have to explain all of that every single time, but in general, I do have a 2-box system when I do any of my wrap-ups. I let you know at some point in each of my book reviews whether or not I am keeping that book on my shelves, whether it is going in my maybe box where I need to like sit and think about it. I need to give myself the distance to make the decision. And then I also have just a no box for no, I do not want to reread this. Because that's what it's really all about for me, is whether or not I want to keep something on my shelves, whether or not I want to reread it. And then when those boxes fill up, I'll be doing an unhaul and a whole video associated with that. So let's get into the stats. And again, these are all the books I read in January, not just the 3 I'm going to talk to you about in depth today. But I read 7 books in January. That means I read 2,224 pages in January, which is huge, at least to me. I know some people just blow that number out of the water, but to me that feels like a lot. I didn't listen to any audiobooks, so no hours listened, and my average rating was a 3.71. My top 3 genres for the month of January were, unsurprisingly, romance, fantasy, and the kicker was actually historical. I read a couple of historical books this month. Again, I've mentioned format a little bit already, but no audiobooks, 2 ebooks, and 5 physical books, which fits pretty well within my normal standards. And then within those 7 books, I owned 4 and borrowed 3 in some capacity or another. Then audience. I read 4 adult books, 1 book that could be classified as new adult, and then 2 young adult books. And then here's where some of the new stats come into play. So these are some of the things that I will be updating you about and tracking every month throughout 2021. So the first new stat to introduce is author ID. So this will be like what pronouns the authors prefer to use, because I'd like to be a little bit better about diversifying that space. I can't promise that it'll happen every month, but I'd like to have it be at the end of the year a bit more prominent than it has been in the past. Of the 7 books I read in January, 6 of them were from authors using she, her pronouns. Which is not a surprise to me at all. I read predominantly women. I don't even consciously think about that, but it's just something I've noticed over the years. And then I had 1 author that goes by they, them pronouns. So that was good to see. I would like to honestly be able to do that a little bit more, but we'll see how that goes throughout the year. I'm also going to be transparent about the author's race. Now, sometimes I won't be able to know that for sure, and when that happens, I will let you know. And then if you have any additional information that I did not track down, that's also always welcome. What I read in January, I read 4 books by Black authors, 2 by white authors, and 1 by an Asian author. And then the other new stat pieces that I'd like to introduce to you before I get to ratings, I would like to talk through a little bit of the types of representation I noticed in these books, and then the trigger warnings overall that I would associate. The type of representation I saw the most this month was in having main characters that were people of color. So 6 of the 7 books I read featured at least 1 main character that was a person of color. The second most common type of representation I saw this month was LGBTQIA+ main characters. Now granted, that's only 2 out of 7. That was The Color Purple, which I'll talk to you about today, and Stage Dreams, which you can go watch my review on that. And then I had 1 out of my 7 books feature a main character who represented fat positivity or body positivity, whichever you prefer to call it. And then I also want to talk about the characters that kind of fill the spaces, our supporting characters, whether they're major supporting characters or minor supporting characters. I still think it's important to talk about representation where it is. So in terms of that, all of the books, all 7, had some form of person of color supporting cast in either major or minor roles, most often major roles. And then 3 out of the 7 books I read had supporting characters that represented the LGBTQA+ community. So that's kind of how my representation broke down, and those were the most prominent forms that I saw this month. And then trigger warnings. So I want to, put this in the forefront of the stats just to kind of like let you know, and then I usually try to tag in the bio below when I do timestamps and things, like what books also have trigger warnings. I'm going to talk about these kind of more broadly and things that I saw as common themes, and then call out which books represented which trigger warnings. I'm also kind of going to talk about these in like severity, because a lot of the things that I'm calling out as potential trigger warnings were not that harmful or not that explicit. So they're kind of in order of severity a little bit. The content that I saw as like the most severe or most present was actually either attempted assault and or sexual trauma. And so that's the one that I would like to warn you broadly about. 2, I like to just this next one's probably going to be in every video I read, because I read a lot of like fantasies that are action oriented, but violence is a potential trigger warning. The only one that I felt actually deserved this in a super explicit way was actually Shadow of the Fox, but I don't think it was super gory. I just think it talked about the way like blood splattered a little bit more than any of the other books I read. So I don't actually think it's a super violent book, but I'm just trying to be transparent about anything that could possibly bother anybody. And right along with that topmost trigger warning, histories of trauma was kind of a theme that I felt really strongly within some of these books. But I'm calling it histories of trauma because I don't think there was one like specific instance that touched all of these books. But for instance, in The Color Purple, there's a lot of that talk about like emotional trauma and the like harm done to the main character through her father. So that was, a very intense history of trauma for that character. Some of the characters in Night Song talk about the intense impact of slavery. And so it's not necessarily something that's going to be harmful to readers, but it is part of the emotional journey that they take you on. Song of Blood and Stone, another book you'll be hearing about from me today, talks about like the impact of racism on one of their characters. So there's like a lot of history of trauma, particularly as it pertains to race in some of the books I read this month. So that's the kind of new section feature of all of the stats. I know that was a lot, but I do think it's really going to add to our conversation and dialogue together about these books. But now let me run through the ratings really quickly. Okay, so I had 1 5-star rating, 2 4.5 star ratings, 1 4-star rating, 0 3.5 stars, but 2 3 stars, no 2.5, and then 1 2-star, and the rest was just 0. So that's where my 7 books come from. And then while I wrap up the stats, one of the things that I want to do, because the things that I treasure most about this channel are when I get recommendations from y'all, or when we get to talk about books that we've all read together. So when I think on this month, there's always going to be gaps, even when I'm trying my best and I'm at my most on it. So I'm always going to ask y'all a question for recommendations, and I'll be doing my own homework and my own research, so it's not going to be all on y'all. But I do want to get your thoughts, because sometimes you all have books that I've never heard of, and I just love that about this. So I've noticed this month and in plenty of months previous that I haven't really delved into any Indigenous authors or Indigenous stories. So what I would love to hear from you is there a book that either has the author and or the main character as an Indigenous person? So I'm going to specifically use that language because I don't want to just limit it to the United States. If you live in a different country and have a different Indigenous culture, like I still want to hear those recommendations. Like any Indigenous reads are totally welcome here. So I'm already aware of authors like Louise Eldritch and Rebecca Roanhorse. Those two are currently on my radar, and I am hoping to be able to read at least one of their books this year. But if you have any recommendations where you were like, oh, this book was so good, you have to check it out, please let me know in the comments below. Okay, that was a lot. I got through all of those stats. I hope that that advanced stats portion is enjoyable for you. But let's talk about the 3 books I read in the latter half of January. So the first was The Color Purple, and that came to me through my Litland. That was originally I think a book with nature on the cover, a historical book with nature on the cover was my challenge for that. And this is a classic that's kind of told through letters. It's an epistolary novel. And I love that. That is like one of my favorite things. I ended up really liking this book. I gave it 4 stars. It's a really dynamically written book, especially if you like that diary or letter writing feel. And it was super quick to read. It was so satisfying to read. So our main character is Celie, who is a young black woman who's married off kind of early. And this is the book that I mentioned earlier as having some serious trauma about like sexual assault and histories of trauma related to that. So we find out really early on in this book that Celie was assaulted by her father. And this really echoes throughout a lot of her life and how she perceives her sense of self-worth, how she thinks about family and like protecting other people in her family. And it definitely informs her opinions on sex, which has a huge like undercurrent throughout the book. So just be aware of that going in. And it's a really empathetically written novel, though. It's really difficult to read at times for that reason, but really beautiful at the same time. One of the enduring loves in Celie's life is her sister, Nettie. Journey of her own, Nettie ends up being a missionary in Africa, and for the majority of these sisters' lives, they are not in contact, but they write letters to each other as though they were. And so it's really, the story is told through both of their perspectives, predominantly Celie's, but you do get really interesting snippets of Nettie's life through her letters as well. About that journey of family, and it's also really steeped in like 1920s, I think, like at post World War I. And it's not necessarily like really blunt in some way that historical novels are, where it's like, here's a date you're going to remember from your history textbooks. Like, no, it's much more casual than that. And it's really about the Black experience in their town too. Like, it's really well done, really well executed. And I understand why it's such a classic. But I will also say that there is LGBTQIA plus representation in this novel. I will not go into the who, what, when, where, why, because again, spoilers, and I don't want to do that to you. This is one that I checked out from the library on a digital loan. And I think I would consider buying it. I do see myself potentially rereading this book, but it was definitely a good read overall. The next book I want to talk to you about is another ebook that I read, and this one was very short. It was actually a novella, and it was The Cupid Mixup by Penelope. So you'll be hearing from me twice about Penelope in this video, because I decided before I started reading the other book that I have to talk to you about from Penelope, The Song of Blood and Stone, I saw on Goodreads that she's actually kind of like known as being a new adult contemporary romance author, and I was like, what? But this is a fantasy. So I tracked down one of her new adult romances, and I kind of wish I hadn't, because I gave The Cupid Mix-Up 2 stars. Yeah, it was just, I've talked to you about this multiple times on this channel before, where I am always game for a novella, but I'm often disappointed with them because I just think they're too short and they don't get the kind of character development that me as a character reader finds very satisfying. So The Cupid Mix-Up follows these 2 characters that are staying at this very fancy hotel in San Francisco, and one of them kind of lives there, and the other one is just staying there temporarily while she checks on an ailing father that she doesn't have a good relationship with, who's in a hospice care situation. I will say that the steamy scenes were pretty nice, pretty good. It was a little spicy, but not too spicy. What ended up really frustrating me with this book was actually the female main character, who I am so sorry, but her name is escaping me. But I ended up really not liking the way that she described herself to others and how she internalized that narrative, because it just felt really harmful. Other than my upset over this character quirk, I don't think it was poorly written. I thought it was a nice little cute novella, very fluffy, with some emotional depth. But I just got so frustrated by this character's like pushing other people away and saying really awful negative things about themselves in a way that was like, this isn't fun for me. I'm only here for like 80 to 100 pages and this is not fun for me. And that's ultimately why I gave it 2 stars. So I regret doing that to myself, because then what did I do? I went right into the book I had to read for Litland, which is Song of Blood and Stone. And this is Elle Penelope's like fantasy series that I think has like 4 books. The last one is coming out super soon, but this is book 1 in the Earthsinger Chronicles. And each of these books follows different main characters that you meet along the way. So book 2 is actually going to follow some characters that you meet towards the end or are referenced to throughout this one. And this one is a 3-star read for me. I really enjoyed certain aspects of this book, and then others just kind of dragged it down for me. So let's talk about what that actually means. We have these 2 kingdoms, Lagrimar and Elsyria, that are separated by this barrier called the Mantle, and it's a magical barrier that's been there for centuries. And every once in a while it gets breached. So it's a really like war-torn area of both of these countries, and one of these countries has magic called Earth Song. And so the kingdom of Lagrimar has people who are Earth Singers. And the king of this country, who's called the True Father, is like the big bad. Now, Elsyria is non-magical. They fear it, they don't like it, but they're very technical. In a lot of ways, this book felt kind of steampunky without being steampunk, because you have that tension between like tech and a time period that doesn't feel right to have that tech. So it's not steampunk in the traditional Victorian aspect, but if you like steampunk stories, this might actually scratch a bit of that itch for you. And our main characters in this novel are Jasminda, who is an Elsyrian citizen whose father was a Lagrimari refugee, so she has Earth Song, and she's been treated terribly in Elsyria for her entire life. It's also worth noting that there is a huge racial divide between Elsyria and Lagrimar. Jack is an Elsyrian spy who is trying to figure out like when the next breach is coming and how to defeat the True Father. He and Jasminda get caught up when Jack gets caught by the Lagrimari, and then it kind of becomes a race to find the truth and like how to save the Elsyrian people and the Lagrimari refugees that are trying to escape the True Father. There's a lot going on in this book. What I liked about it, let's start there, because there is some really good stuff. It's not the densest book I've read. I did specifically buy the version with expanded scenes. So if you're interested in this, I would actually recommend checking out the version that's not expanded. Because one of my problems with this book was that I just felt like it took too long. So I did that to myself by buying the expanded edition, and I didn't realize that was going to be a problem. So if you're interested, I actually highly recommend checking out the one that's shorter, because I think it would be just a better reading experience. But what I liked about it, there's romance, and it's really fun romance to read. I also really liked that it was multiple perspectives done well. So you're not only in the head of Jack or Jasminda, there are some other characters that have like supporting storylines that all interweave and connect. And basically the 4 people whose minds you're in the most are both in relationships with one another. So if you are a romance-prone reader and you're looking for light romance with some fantasy elements, this is actually a great read for you. And I think the romance with both sets of characters that you see throughout this is definitely what kept me coming back to this book, because I cared about them. They were very sweet. There was a little bit of angst in one of them, and there's like a mystery in one of the other subplots. So it's just, that part was a lot of fun for me. Why I'm giving this 3 stars is that you've heard me talk throughout this channel about how annoyed I get when I feel like I can see the plot coming a mile away. I've said before that I'm a very character-oriented reader. I do like to puzzle things out though when it comes to the plot. And if I can puzzle it out too quickly, to me that's a huge problem, because I want that mental engagement, you know, like I want it more. And this within like yay big amount of book, like a tiny amount of book, I was like, okay, here's what's going to happen for the rest of this novel. And lo and frickin' behold, I was right. Again, I am not like some genius that figures stuff out really easily. I'm not trying to like pat myself on the back and be like, oh, I'm so smart. No, I'm medium smart at best when it comes to stuff like this. And if my medium smart plot divining self can figure it out, it's not good. You know what I mean though? It was very transparent, and what ended up keeping me going through this book, like I said, was those character relationships, which is why I think it ends up at a 3-star for me, because like I really like the character aspects of it. I am not convinced that I need to own this, so this is actually going in the no box, because I don't think I'm going to reread this. I do think I would continue with the rest of the series because I did love those relationships, but I think those would be library checkouts for me if I would like to continue. So that's really unfortunate for me because I was really looking forward to this. I was hoping for another like epic fantasy romance situation, and I got like 50% of the way there. Okay, so that's my wrap up. That's the 3 books I read in the last half of January. If you're interested in the 4 books I read in the first half of January, you can find that link down below. I am still kind of going to be working out the kinks in the delivery of my stats and things like that, but I am really enjoying the half wrap-up system, so we're going to keep going with that. And again, don't forget to let me know if you have any book recommendations for me with Indigenous authors or Indigenous main characters. I'm really excited to hear what you think about that. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I hope you have a fantastic reading day. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of me or this channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!